Environment building can be a very technical process, and it's very important and critical to get familiar with the application that you're planning to use to build your environments. In this case, I'm using Maya. So the first thing to know is that there are several ways there are several ways to go about doing something, and none of them is right and none of them is wrong. It's really just whatever works for you. In this case, I'm using curves because using a curve allows me to establish the profile of a shape very quickly. You can go create EP curve and set it to linear, and that way you'll be able to draw very straight curves that you can use to create a profile. Once you're happy with that curve, you go to surfaces, revolve, and you basically revolve it, and then at that point you're only worried about tweaking the profile itself instead of mangling and moving all the vertices in your model, right? And this is a very nice way to quickly shape out things, because if you start with a box and you start extruding it and all that, you probably get the same results, but it just takes a little bit longer to see the result. Not to mention that I can go to a front view, and then with the front view, all I worry about then is the silhouettes. I'm really just figuring out the shapes, thickness, like what reads well from far away. And sometimes that's hard to do if you're only extruding. And that way, you also eventually you start mixing up a little bit of both words. So you start using beveling, and also sometimes you don't have to really weld things together, so you can pass two models through each other just to see what kind of shapes you're gonna get. And then eventually you start getting more complex, and you start using extrusions, beveling. You start merging vertices, you start cutting things and creating shapes. And then really all this adds up to having fun. And then you can also do mirroring, right? So you can mirror, and you can set the negative scale values, and then it will mirror over, pretty much. And then you can use that to create corners and assemble things together. You can also use an approach, like a real life approach, to create frames. So just like you would do a door frame, you could use the same approach to be able to stitch your stuff together. You put your two trims next to each other, you cut them, and then you weld them together, right? And the tool that I'm using is not a tool that is in Maya anymore. It used to be a very common tool before, but it's kind of hidden in there, and it's called a polygon tool. And you have to go to a hotkey editor to dig it out. If you watch the video, you can see how I dug it out. So eventually, though, you're gonna start flying. You're gonna start flying through your model and trying out shapes. You're gonna start exploring that shape language and making sense of all these things going together, right? And this process, this entire thing from beginning to end of making a model for an environment, it's all repetition, because you're going to be doing the same things a lot, But one of the most important things to understand is that you have to be able to, you have to understand how to use the grid, okay? And being able to adjust the size of the grid up and down is crucial. Understanding texture ratio while you're building these things is also very important, because what that means is you wouldn't build something giant like this and then later on realize that you can't really bake it down to a texture because it looks blurry. So you have to build everything on multiples of 2. You have to make sure that things are snapped on the grid properly. And like I said, initially, you don't have to be precise. You can be a little sloppy just to figure stuff out. But typically, eventually, you have to take a step back and check yourself and clean up, right? In this case, what I'm trying to do is I got the pillars made, and now I need some sort of facade and using a four-sided cylinder, a four-sided square. Excuse me, a 4 meter square. I'm able to cover lots of area, and then 4 meters still multiples of 2, so I will know that everything will kind of just snap together. For this taller pillars, it would be impossible to try to build that into one asset because it's such a long piece. Is more than 4 meters. So now I'm starting to talk about a little of textile ratio. And all you really need to know is that for this class, we're using 5 total pixels per meter. So that means that for every meter, there are 500 total pixels. So if you had 4 meters, that would be 2048 pixels per meter, right? So we're going to be using a 2048 texture. And what that means is that we have to make sure that everything is less than 4 meters, because if it's more than 4 meters, it's not going to fit on the sheet. Also, you have to take into account that when you unwrap things, they're going to end up taking up more space. But I will cover that in another video. So for now, I just wanted to bring it up because it's very important. So going back to this thing, when you're building your environments, sometimes it's very important to be able to see what you're doing. So using the blend material with the dark diffuse and the high specular is insanely helpful. And not only does it look cool, but it helps bring the edges to light. It helps you see what you're building better. And in that note, adding bevels to your meshes is very important as well, because using the bevel, it helps you catch the light. And also, it can so the model, eventually when you're done, you're not gonna, your model is not gonna just catch the light just because it has a normal map. So you're gonna need some kind of bevels in there, right? And so the reason why it's also important is because at this stage, because I have a nice shiny material in my mesh, I'm able to see the details clearer from far away, right? And like I said earlier, you don't have to redo everything every time. You can use pieces that you already have laying around in your scene to try to mock up something new, right? And this process is kind of slow for some people. Other people, this is very fun. I always find that building an environment from scratch is almost like drawing on an empty sheet of paper. When you start, there's nothing, but once you get in the groove, things start to look like something, and you just have to know that it takes time for that to happen. Okay. And here though, I have these big pillars on the side, and now I'm starting to get into smaller details, right? When you're building architecture, you have to make sure that the architecture feels heavy, and then you do that by adding layers and adding different steps and different, objects. Also, in the final product, things don't all have to be snapped together. Like if you have little statues that attach, like gargoyles, for example. So this little piece here, I'm imagining that it would be some kind of statue that kind of attaches to the sides, right? And then you see how by doing all of this thing, like it's just starts to add a lot of depth in the scene just by having simple shapes, right? Having a combination of long pillars and short pillars, smaller pillars, it just adds a lot of like very nice, interesting shapes to look at. And so when you start this stuff out, it has to be built very simple, and just slowly, gradually build it up. But also, you don't just build it up from stuff from your mind. You have to make sure that you're paying attention to your reference, that you're having that you're keeping in mind what is it that you're building. Right now I was thinking of making some kind of gothic cathedral thing, and I'm figuring out the main walls, right? So it's a little involved, and I know that, but I know that if I do it well, then once everything's in there, and then all I have to do is worry about making the pieces and do them well, and then at the end, everything's just gonna fall in place, right? If I were to do this backwards and make the pieces first and then try to put the level together, things wouldn't, it would just simply not work. You know, you'll be wrestling with things and figuring out where stuff goes, and things don't snap together. There's gonna be holes, and everything's gonna not look like it goes together. So it's very important to take your time to block out a scene thoroughly. How much detail you put in really depends on how much you want to show off to yourself. How much you want to prove. Like how many problems you want to answer right away. So like if I would had statues in my level, I probably would put them in there and maybe take them to ZBrush very quickly and then do some stuff to them and decimate it, and then bring that decimated model back, and that's what I would use as a model. But I wouldn't spend like a day or two on that statue. I literally spend maybe 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And so because of that, I would probably have to use some kind of preset human person and maybe do some stuff, And so you'll see that it's just a lot of repetition, And then as I'm working through this, I know that things snap, and then I know I'm kind of starting to establish the shape language. I try the shapes in Maya first, like the pieces in Maya first, before I even take them to the engine, so I know that things work well together. And that way, when I take them to the engine individually, I'll be able to piece it very well, right? I also try the pieces to try to achieve other things, right? So, for example, here it occurred to me that I could create some kind of altar, and I'm trying to see if the pieces will support, creating an altar, and they kind of do, except I don't have an end piece, And then a lot of the times, it's very easy to put an end piece together using the same trims. You just have to figure out how to cut it, and then you use the same approach that you use to create a picture frame in real life. You cross two pieces of wood together, and then you simply cut them, right? Once you cut that, you just go one vertex at a time and weld it together. And then later on, that could be a high poly of its own. You already know that it works. Or you could make the trim straight and then repeat the whole process once your low poly is baked down. Once your high poly is baked down to a low poly. Another thing to mention is that Maya has a real-time viewport. It's not the best, but it can get you some nice results. So if you simply just create a directional light, and go to the render 2.0 settings and enable AO, and then you also are gonna need to create some kind of like ambient light, and then simply using the buttons on top of the viewport, then you can start turning on the shadows, the lighting, and the ambient occlusion. You're also gonna need an ambient light and set it to a very low amount to be able to see your stuff. And then that way you don't have to go to Unreal or Marmoset every time if you're just testing stuff out.